Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Sherry, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you to our very timely topical discussion. My role is a brief one. I get to introduce our convener moderator and our four guests. Our convener is my colleague and the director of our Center for Immigrant, Refugee, and Global Health at CUNY, Dr. Kathleen Crivero. Kathleen is known to many of you in many different ways. She's served in senior roles in UNICEF and UNAIDS and UNDP and as Undersecretary General of the United Nations and as president of Oak Foundation and now a member of our faculty here at CUNY. Our four guests today, who she and they will say a little more about. Jasmine Slojas is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Migration Policy Institute, known to some of you in her previous role as the Executive Director of the Berkeley Migration Initiative. Madeline Reese is the Global Strategies Advisor and Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Madeline is a lawyer and who has previously worked throughout the area of human rights and gender issues, including at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Viktor Boguslavsky is a physician by training from Ukraine, and he is currently the Senior Technical Advisor at the Center for Technical Excellence at the University Research Corporation. In the past, he's served as the Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia and the Country Director for almost a decade in the Russian Federation. And finally, Dr. Paul Spiegel is Director of the Center for Humanitarian Health at Johns Hopkins University. Paul is also known to many of you in his previous incarnation at the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So without further ado, let me turn this over to my colleague, Kathleen, who will take us further in this little journey today. Kathleen?
Thank you very much, Jim. And I want to thank our panelists for being with us. I'll be having some dialogue with each of the panelists, then we'll have a response from Viktor Boguslavsky, and then hopefully we'll have about a half an hour for questions and answers before Jim closes the webinar. We are having a slight problem with the registration link, so I think people will be joining as the seminar, as the webinar proceeds, because we're trying to fix that now. But we will start in any case. How we're going to run this is that, as I said, Lisa Hitch, who's also, you can see here, she'll be helping me moderate the chat for after we go through each of the short dialogue with each of the panelists. So we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. Lisa will be picking up on various issues that are raised and trying to group them so that we can respond to as many of the concerns raised as possible. So we're waiting for our colleague Paul Siegel to join. So I'm going to start with Jasmine Slojas, who, as Jim said, is with the Migration Policy Institute in Europe, and has both a career there focusing on migrant health, labor market integration, and migrants' access to services and integration policies, as well as previously a career in academia. So I know that Jasmine has been extremely involved in responding to the events in Ukraine and supporting European governments and advocates to respond appropriately. So let me start, Jasmine, by just saying that it seems like issues related to migrant health and migrant health policy are often overlooked in analyses of migration flows and the situations that occur. In your view, is this happening in Ukraine? And why do you think that migrant health policy kind of falls off the radar when something happens like this?
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for setting up this wonderful event and inviting me to be here. I think this is a really important point that you are mentioning. I think migrant health, refugee health is often the one forgotten that falls off the agenda. And this happens again now in the current situation. So for example, when we look at the very historical response in Europe to this particular situation, the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive in Europe, we see that it provides access to the labor market, it provides access to education, social welfare, housing. But the one thing that's really missing, according to me, is full access to healthcare. It does provide access to emergency healthcare and essential healthcare access for illnesses, but it does not properly or fully provide access to healthcare. And this is incredibly important and unfortunate that this is happening, because if we hope for the people that are coming to our countries to participate in the labor market, to participate in education, after all the perilous journeys they have been through, they are facing uncertainty. They are often unsure what is happening with the loved ones they have left behind, uncertain if they can return. This creates a lot of psychosocial stress, in addition to other maybe existing health problems they already have. They need full access to healthcare to, well, first of all, for their health, but also to allow them to integrate afterwards into our societies and not create more problems in the long term moving forward. Yeah.
Great. And I know that the Migration Policy Institute is working with the University of New Hampshire in the UK to collect health data on migrants. And what will that data provide? And do you hope it will be a model for other countries?
Absolutely. Yes. No, we're working with the University of Southampton with two excellent colleagues, Michael Head and Ken Brackstone, and they have launched an online survey for displaced people from Ukraine, both internally displaced, but also globally. And it's really mapping their health needs and their current access to healthcare, in addition to also looking into their current housing conditions. Are they staying in government housing with volunteers that have welcomed them to their homes, but also their intention to stay? And also, do they know how to navigate the healthcare system? How long will their medication supplies last, for example? And why this is so important is because currently, when I talk to policymakers right now, the biggest question they keep asking me is, they need information in order to create targeted policies that properly address the needs of these people. They need to know what their health needs are, what is the profile of the group, and what are their most pressing needs. And this will help more effective policy making and a more effective response of organizations on the ground, not only for policymakers, but also the many, many NGOs and civil society organizations that are involved here. And for example, we have some first results coming out, and it was quite surprising to me that just with the first respondents, we saw that over 75% of the people that filled in the survey mentioned that they have chronic health problems. And this is a very high percentage. And it's only 4,000 respondents at the moment, but we're collecting more data. And if anyone wants to collaborate and help get the survey further out there, please get in touch. But I think it's crucial to create effective policies to know what the needs are, and also in time of limited resources and when many countries and health systems are still overwhelmed, recovering after COVID, to target the limited resources to the most pressing needs that are out there right now. Great,
thanks. And let me ask you a question that I know you're probably asked every day now. How long is this going to last? I think there's the feeling out there that Ukrainians are going to go back to the Ukraine as soon as they can. And what impact does this have on the integration? Looking at, the time frame that countries are looking at in terms of the integration of the Ukrainians that are arriving in neighboring countries now.
Yes, no, this is a great question. And unfortunately, I don't have the answer, but I have some information that I can share. I think it very much depends on the further development of the conflict and how long it will last. And this depends, of course, on many different factors. So once safety returns, I think many people and many people who have fled Ukraine have the strong intention to return to their home. And actually, if we look at the data right now, we have already seen that more than 1 million people have already returned. So that's a very high number, while the conflict is, of course, still going on in certain areas. And it's quite interesting if we look a little bit more into why people returned, and we see some people are going back temporarily with also wanting to leave the country again, often visiting family, picking up stuff. Many people have left in a very urgent hurry, and now the area is more safe. They want to get more items, but also a few people are returning back home because they have difficulties finding housing. So that's also quite interesting to see how the integration response or service response is fueling kind of the return back home partially as well, although this is a very small percentage. But yeah, in general, we don't know how long people will stay. Many do have the strong intention to return. Yet we know from previous flows of migrants, whether it was labor migrants or also refugees, at times we think it will be temporary, but oftentimes they stay longer than intended. And it's really a missed opportunity if you don't invest in integration right away. People are waiting, they're waiting in limbo. If they end up staying for a long time, it's important to start learning the language and integrating right from the start. Yeah, so I think that's really important to focus on that as well. And we see also some experimentation in this area, and that is, we see some experimentation with integration light programs. So just providing basic language courses, more based on internet, so not giving the full program. So there's also a lot of experimentation and innovation in integration, which could also provide lessons for the future.
Great, thanks so much, Yasmin. One last question. This seems to be, very much of a Europe, a crisis or a challenge to Europe. I mean, do you see the European institutions stepping up? Do you think European governments and the institutions within them are pulling together on this?
Absolutely, yes. The activation of the Temporary Protection Directive was really historical. It was the activation was unanimous. All countries participated, and migration can be a very contentious topic in Europe and in the EU. And here, really, countries came together for a united approach. So this is very promising to see. But at the same time, I would also like to highlight that it's not just Europe welcoming the refugees from Ukraine, and that also, for example, Canada has pledged to take in an unlimited number of Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion, and they have their own legal mechanism to welcome Ukrainians into the country. So, and of course, that's also very welcome that multiple nations around the world help respond to this big conflict.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. I'd now like to turn to Madeline Rees. Madeline, as Jim pointed out, Madeline has worked at a national level as a lawyer in the UK. She's worked at the regional level, putting many cases in front of the European Court for Human Rights, etc. And she's worked at the international level, most recently with MADRE and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, but also with the UN, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and perhaps most famously in Bosnia, where Madeline stood up against enormous human rights abuses and trafficking in that country. So she has been on the front line working with women's groups in many situations like this. So Madeline, I'd just like to start by asking you, I know many analyses describe this as a very gendered conflict. And from your point of view, first of all, do you agree with that? And what does that suggest to you?
Yeah, I totally agree with it. But the other thing is what conflict is not highly gendered. I mean, if you look at any of the wars that we've had to witness, be participant in, watch, whatever, they're all highly gendered. And I think it's almost inevitable, because when there is conflict, it's almost as if we go to our default positions. We think of security as militarized. We think of militarized as being about masculinities. We think of men as fighters and women as victims. And I think one of those, the most difficult thing about that, then it goes back into the very characteristics idea of a particular form of masculinity, the one that's prepared to do battle, which is unhelpful, and it really reinforces those gender stereotypes, which we thought we were overcoming as we move forward, given this absolute determination on the part of many to get rid of this binary narrative. But that comes back with conflict, and the consequences of that now are being very clearly shown, I think, in the context of Ukraine. If we peel back that notion of the men as the fighters and the victims, it's way more complex. And all conflicts, absolutely are built on, or the consequences are built on the fault lines that there were before the conflict started. So if you look at a political economy from a gendered perspective before, you will see very likely what is likely to be intensified during the conflict. And so in Ukraine, there was, we've done a lot of research there prior to the conflict on the impact of such things as the austerity measures encouraged by or enforced by the IFIs, how that had a gender dimension in removing women from local participation in governance structures, getting them out of employment where it was government employment. The usual consequences, I think, of particular forms of economic policies. As a result, there was already a very difficult role for women, particularly from 2014 onwards, when they took on additional roles with the conflict of carers and caring for veterans, often disabled, huge increases in domestic violence. And as a result, when we get to this level of conflict, we now have building on a frailty, if you like, within the society itself. So the reports that are coming out now show that this gendered political economy is now deepening, with particular discriminations on those who were most marginalized in the first place. We're talking about Roma women, female-headed households, the LGBTQ community, which is experiencing a particular form of pushback because now there is a dominant narrative growing of family values in order to reinforce the necessity of keeping family together. And that, of course, is a negative impact on people from that particular community. And we're seeing there have already been attacks on those who were leaders of the movement. So I think that's a particular worrying facet of it, but again, inevitable and has been, I think, seen in just about every conflict when you do need this particular narrative to dominate. But the thing I think also is it also hides the reality. Because the reality is, I'm so sure, as Yasmin just identified, in the migrant flows, the majority of people fleeing are women and children. They are. But the other reality is that, so that helps the narrative of the men as fighters, the women as victims. But the other reality is what's actually happening in Ukraine is very different. That you do have exactly the same as we saw in Bosnia. It's the women who are doing increased care. They're doing the social reproduction work. We don't hear about that because that's part of a narrative which doesn't fit with what the media are likely wanting to portray at the moment, which is all about, that wars can be won, but we don't look at how you actually build and hold communities together during the course of that conflict. Mm-hmm. So I think, if you actually look at do an examination of what women are doing now, it's increasing the amount of community care, of family care, increasing need to manage the finances, because often the men are away fighting. There's also incredible roles being played by women who are organizing evacuations, doing humanitarian distribution, all in a context in which there is now an increase of violence against women. There's been violence against women in the shelters, the lack of disaggregated gender facilities in IDP camps has caused attacks on women. So there's a lot of inevitabilities about what is happening in Ukraine, built on a political economy which is caused from the outside, exacerbated by the narrative that we in the West have particularly encouraged, which is all about how well the war is going, not going, without paying attention to the intricacies of what's really keeping communities and everything together.
Let me ask, you talked some about the roles that women are playing inside Ukraine. I know that the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom does a lot of work with women that are in crisis situations, and finding that women actually can be drivers of peace, and really reach across lines. Are you finding this is possible in Ukraine, or is it too early yet? And I know that you often connect women from Syria with women from Bosnia. Is any of this going on now?
This is a tough one. I think it's too soon, and we were a little naive because we did and have already engaged with a lot of the women partners that we had from before. And there is a very severe split now. There are women who have been, you go on webinars and what are they putting that they want delivered? They want weapons, they want night goggles, they want this, that, and the other. They want to be able to continue to fight. And you have the other women who were the peace builders from the beginning, who were trying to build peace across the divides, who are now being, I would say, sort of harassed for having fed into a different narrative. We are actually now going to hold a series of retreats and convenings for women from Ukraine. We did initially think that there had been contact with Russian women's groups before, but none of Ukrainians now want to speak with the Russians, not yet, it's too soon. And I think that is a sad factor of the extremities of violence that we visited upon them. They do want, absolutely, they do want to meet with Syrians, with Afghan women, because that's the closest, most recent of the experiences. But it's a very difficult discourse. I think there is a slight shift. There's a report coming out now that, I mean, before that, just to say, there's 35,000 women frontline, and they're a bit miffed at us feminists for not having credited them with being frontline. And that, of course, is part of this narrative. We should be supporting. They want us to be supporting women's participation. And yet, more than 60% of the women are saying they want to do the humanitarian support for the resistance. That's what they want to be doing. So whether that means over time, there will be a shift in this narrative, I do think that over time, and that is important, there will be a change. And what we really need to see happen is that political economy I referred to being actually surfaced into a process for peace, so that when we do get to an outcome, then what women have experienced, what they have seen has been partly causal of the nature of the violations they've suffered now, is given redress.
Right.
But it's a lot of work in its early days.
Right. And a similar question, I know in a lot of these situations, there's local women's groups that have been working for decades in all sorts of ways in countries like Ukraine, but then a crisis like this happens and all the financing and the support is going to the international groups, either UN or international NGOs. And I know that Madre is all about getting support and continuing to work with local women's organizations. Is that happening in Ukraine? Are the local women's organizations, are they getting the support? Of course, it's not adequate, but are they getting support to continue at what they're doing?
There's been a shift in what they can do. Just about everyone we have worked with has now shifted completely to humanitarian. I mean, that's almost inevitable. So it's two things. One, it's helping transfer funding to local organizations to give financial support to those who are most in need, and that's what Madge's been focusing on, and also to give financial support for those who want to leave. So that's been huge and been very, very efficient and quite effective, I think, in what it's doing. But that's the constant need, rather than for the women's organizations to be able to continue doing what they were doing before, because there's been a total disruption in all of this, actually, obviously. And, this collapse in, domestic violence, this isn't dealt with. The police are no longer responding to anything in relation to domestic violence. There are other things to do. So, you can see where there's a need for this funding to continue, a need for the work to be done, but it's extraordinarily difficult, I think, to make it so it's possible.
Right.
But funding, hugely important, and to the right people, people.
Now, a final question in this first round, Madeleine. There's been a lot, of course, around Bucha and other places around the sexual violence that's taking place in various parts of Ukraine, largely around the Russian soldiers when they're in control or retreating, etc. I know that you've spent a good part of your professional life trying to deal with this issue, as have I. And I just wondered, what is your reflect? I mean, has anything changed, either maybe not in the behavior of soldiers, but even the way the world responds to it? Are you seeing any change at all?
No.
There you go.
No, I mean, really not. And I don't know, that one of the best reports I've ever read was the Commission of Inquiry report for Syria on They Stole My Dignity, which was an investigation into the use of sexual violence in Syria. And that should have been a game changer, because it showed exactly why and how sexual violence is used against men, women, boys and girls, where it happens, who, what, where, and how. That's what it showed. And it actually explained, it illustrated how that changes according to the way in which the war is fought. So I think the patterns of violence that we're seeing now will change if and when the Russians do advance into communities. And there are detention facilities or whatever comes next. We hope to God not. But just to say that there is evidence of sexual violence against men, we're not hearing about it. And that's for all the multiplicity of reasons that we don't hear about violence against men. We also have that rather, I think, unfortunate, is probably not even the right word, but a tendency for journalists and documenters, investigators to seek out sexual violence and really look for it as being a defining factor for women in conflict. And of course, there is sexual violence. We don't know how much. I think the fear of it is really working extraordinarily well. You know, some of the people we were talking to, they're absolutely desperate to get morning after pills, contraception, and, you know, realistically, it's probably not as necessary as they were fearing it would be. But at the same time, that's certainly just to say that I think the focus on sexual violence often detracts from all the other experiences that women have during the conflict, when women, men, and boys. Because we have to understand the totality of the experience rather than focusing on one narrow element of it, which then has a reinforcement of stigma and makes it more difficult for women then to come forward and participate as fulsomely as they could do. And that's happened in every single conflict. The gendered consequences of sexual violence are enormous in terms of how you can then continue to have your life afterwards.
Thank you, Madeline. I'm sure we'll have questions coming back to these issues. Let me now turn to Paul, Dr. Paul Spiegel, who has joined us. Yes, thank you, Paul. I know, and as Jim mentioned in the beginning, Paul started his career as an epidemiologist with CDC. He's worked with a number of UN agencies, including, well, Médecins Sans Frontières is an international NGO, but then UNHCR. He continues to work with WHO, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And he currently heads the Center for Humanitarian Health at Johns Hopkins. So welcome, Paul. And I know you just came back from 6.5 weeks in countries around Ukraine, including Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Romania. And I just, of course, it all seems that they're making an incredible effort to respond to what is an unprecedented flow of people into cities and even small towns around the borders. I just wonder if you could share some of your impressions of your 6.5 weeks, and are they, are neighboring countries cooperating? Are you seeing very different things happening in each one? But just to share some impressions.
Sure. Excuse me. Thank you, and apologies for being a bit late. Yeah, this is a very different situation, I would say, than I've seen in the past. And I did do work in the Balkans and Kosovo. I would say number one is just the incredible outpouring of welcoming from everyone, from the average person all the way up to the governments. It's been interesting to see. I would say there's been a strong emphasis and on focus on the journey, the refugee journey. So we visited a lot of the frontiers, at the borders, and then as they move towards the reception centers. And there, from a health point of view, which is what I was focusing on, it was extremely well done. It was chaotic at the beginning, and there were big protection issues and we'll see mental health comes up consistently. But from a basic health point of view, in terms of ensuring that there was first aid, ensuring that there was a referral pathway, it's been very, very well done for the most part. And it's really been governments, local NGOs, and just the volunteers themselves. An area that I think we need to look more closely at is are the communities themselves, where people are taking up temporary protection. And maybe we can talk about that afterwards. I won't continue on right now.
Great, thanks. And I know you're a part of a World Health Organization mission, and this is again, a lot of the work is happening in European countries. And I just wondered if you're seeing, is the role different for the UN and international actors in this so-called European crisis than it is in some of the others you've seen? And I know you've seen the Kosovo and Bosnia also, but from some of the others you've been in?
Yeah. Very different. In the five surrounding countries of Ukraine, Moldova is the only non-EU country, and it's a bit more of a traditional UN international NGO response. But in the EU countries, and I would say this very positively, the governments are taking control. They have the competency to do so. They have the health systems, the education systems are very strong, and with the EU temporary protection, the refugees have the opportunity to work, to go to school. They have the same access to healthcare as nationals. Doesn't mean it's free. There are co-payments, et cetera, and every country is slightly different. And I would say that it's a challenge to the UN and the international NGOs because the way, the coordination model, all of the assessments, the refugee response plans are not developed for a situation like this. And it was recognized early on that there has to be a lighter and more flexible role, but I think this will be a good example of how the UN and the international NGOs will need to change in the future. As in the 2016 Humanitarian Summit, the idea is to, in terms of localization and to ensure that governments and national NGOs and local NGOs really take the lead. And I don't think we're ready for that yet in terms of the UN and the international NGOs.
And as this goes on, I mean, there's been an outpouring of openness and welcoming and integration, but as this goes on now, and it could go on for months, I mean, how long can this level of support be sustained? Or is it, with the EU funds coming in, is it sort of limitless, or are you just seeing, just the infrastructures are going to become really strained at a certain point, or not?
Yeah, no, we're already seeing this. I believe it will follow a very similar pattern that we've seen in many humanitarian emergencies, certainly in Syria, with Jordan and Lebanon and other countries. There will be a fatigue and potentially a resentment, I think, against the Ukrainians. Nothing to do with the Ukrainians, but to do with the situation. Number one is many Ukrainians are living with host families, or they're put up in hotels or dormitories, and thankfully there aren't refugee camps or anything like that. That's a wonderful thing, but I don't think the host families thought that they would be hosting these people for months, even a year. And so there's going to be a very, very big challenge sooner rather than later in terms of what to do with regard to shelter for the Ukrainian refugees in this situation. And then that's going to have a huge amount of knock-on effects depending on what happens there. But there also, I think we need to avoid the pitfalls that we often do in refugee settings, which is concentrate on the refugees and not equally on the vulnerable host populations, so that we can avoid or at least reduce any resentment that may occur. And there are many ways to do that. And I think the countries that I visited are considering that. They're paying a certain amount of money per refugee to the host family to be able to host them. They're doing a lot of different, they're considering, the government's doing a lot of different things to try to address this issue. I think an incredibly strong communication strategy, proactive communication strategy would be very important as well.
Right. Some of these innovations, as it were, like hosting refugees in houses and then supporting the families that are hosting them, do you think that's completely unique to this situation? I mean, do you expect that to be something that may become a model for other situations, or is this just very unique?
In Jordan and Lebanon at one point, there was a lot of consideration. Now, the governments were not as well off, so that it was often the UN that would be supporting or providing some sort of funding to families to host these. But it was very difficult to regulate, and a lot of problems occurred in that situation. I think it's a possibility to continue this, but I do feel that people will fatigue, and it's not a longer term solution. And again, I don't think we know what's going to happen, but it certainly appears to be more protracted, and that many people will decide not to go back immediately. And then there's going to be a whole other issue that, in terms of education, in terms of the stresses on the healthcare systems. Surprisingly and pleasantly, the healthcare systems currently don't appear to be overstretched, because you have a lot of relatively healthy women and children. And yes, there certainly are elderly and aged people, but they're not overwhelming the system at this point. That may also change in the future.
Right. And they're not overwhelming the health. I mean, they're physically healthy, but I know from previous humanitarian situations, the mental and psychological and trauma related needs of people often gets sidetracked for the physical care that people need, or the life-saving support. And now, if the physical life-saving support seems less of an issue, are we learning how to respond to mental health and trauma related needs in a better way? Or
yeah, I mean, it's compared to a decade or 2 decades ago, certainly. And this is, luckily, mental health is not considered secondary, I don't believe anymore. And certainly in this crisis, it's one of the earliest issues that have come up. WHO and other organizations are already, from early on, even before they had overall health working groups, they had mental health working groups. But that being said, there are a lot of challenges. One is not to medicalize the mental health, because there are so many social and community-based issues that must occur. And I want to get to that in 1 second, but also one of the problems is in many of these countries, like in most countries around the world, there are not enough psychiatrists and psychologists, often for the national populations, number one. Number two is, depending on how the insurance is in these situations, there may be limitations of how often people can access psychologists. And then even more complicated is that for particularly for talk therapy, for cognitive behavioral therapy, one needs to be able to speak the language and I think understand the culture. There is a lot of discussion already about ensuring that Ukrainian refugee healthcare workers can actually practice. That's also a big lesson learned, and this occurred in other countries. Turkey did this very well. However, because it's the EU and it's quite regulated, and some legislation has been passed, a lot of it still depends on speaking the language, being certified, and having being under supervision of a national. That being said, there are some innovative ways, and I'll end maybe just this question by saying in both the Czech Republic as well as in Slovakia, we visited what we can call Ukrainian medical points, and these are Ukrainian doctors who had been trained in that host country, and they've been set up, and they are hiring some of the Ukrainian healthcare workers more as paying them as administrators because they cannot practice. And it's a nice way to be able to ensure that Ukrainian refugees are getting the needed help in their own language. And on top of that, because there aren't enough general practitioners, particularly just in general, but also who speak the language. And they're the gatekeepers. So there needs to be a workaround to try to address this issue, at least in the short term.
yeah, interesting. Some of these issues haven't come up in other places. So that's an interesting point. Great. I'm sure we'll come back to this also in the discussion. But I wonder, just turning to Victor now, and again, as Jim briefly introduced, Victor is the Senior Technical Advisor at the Center for Technical Excellence at the University Research Company in Washington, D.C. He has also served as their director in Russia and has, I think, a unique perspective of being a Ukrainian that worked many, many years in Moscow while he had very close family across the border in Ukraine. So I think he looks at this both from a professional, technical point of view and a very personal point of view. So Victor, we'd love to have your reactions to some of what you've heard and just your experience of what's happening as a Ukrainian.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen, and thank you very much for inviting me to this great event. I'm just listening to the experts, and I'm learning of how huge this crisis is actually, and someone who is a Ukrainian. I started my professional career in Ukraine as a public health physician and researcher, working for international development programs there with USAID, and then moved across the region. I do maintain my family connections, professional connections and friends in Ukraine, in addition to the experience that I had in Russia. And I was more thinking about from the of course I can be biased on this one, but as an Ukrainian, but I was just thinking about there's a large number of well, first of all, one point I'd like to say that I'm hearing repeatedly from many my Ukrainian sort of friends and family members actually who are part of Ukraine, who are some of the outside of Ukraine, who really want to go back to Ukraine. They really want to wait for the time when it's safe, and they want to go back, because many of them just left the country overnight without having no plans to stay outside, but they had just to be forced to leave. And there are several reasons for that. Is sort of a lot of families have their sort of extended families and husbands in Ukraine, and they feel they need to be more connected. There is another financial consideration. Some people who are particularly outside of the country really need some financial means to support, and I think they find more comfort being in Ukraine. I'm just seeing there's a lot of, I just recently spoke to someone in Kyiv, and they said there's just more cars, more people coming back. I read that in Western Ukraine, in Lviv Oblast, particularly, that people coming back, and to be on that part, and it's like thousands, and if 30,000 people a day coming back. So again, I will take the point of Jasmine made. Some people might just come back, sort of restore, or repack and go back. It's very hard to tell. But I'd like to actually focus also on a couple of points. I think this whole crisis, to me personally, is the situation where you see resilience and the hope, and for people to get to the victory if they will, or get some to the peace resolution on this war situation. I'm calling this war. Because they just don't believe that they want to live in the country. There's a whole sense of survival they have to practice right now, and there's a large number of people who are internally displaced. And I think officially this is about like 7 million people who are internally displaced to central parts of Ukraine from eastern parts. Those are central parts of Ukraine, and western parts. They're kind of more intact and not directly affected by the conflict, and they are located in the local communities and Hromadas who are absorbing them and trying to sort of accommodate for their needs, including healthcare needs, but also some basic needs, including education for children, getting them to schools, getting them to become sort of supporters and members of those communities. So what and obviously there's a lot of health services and the needs for maintaining essential health services, and particularly for pregnant women, people with chronic conditions, talking about all sorts of ages, right? Starting from young families and children and elderly people, with disabilities and chronic care. They do get some support, and they get services are being maintained, although it's really disrupted, particularly at the primary care level. I'm actually reading some maybe not systematic, but some evidence that are premature births, and babies being born. So I think that's a whole issue of interrupted antenatal care, and then the referrals to specialty care like incubators for babies who need to be supported. So there's a lot of issues there, but I think the whole sense of self-organization and the community, local community support at the Hromada level. If you know, the Hromada is the new administrative unit that has been created, as part of the Ukraine sort of move towards decentralization. And those are local governments, like you can have 60 of those Hromadas in one of the oblasts that, mobilize resources to provide humanitarian support, including food and medical support and needs and educational needs for children, but also housing. And, thinking about in the longer term, how do they kind of sustain that sort of part? But I think there's a lot of local resources being sort of utilized by these local governments and by, of course, with the support from the international organizations and other national organizations and businesses to support that the sense of survival, and for people to hoping to kind of get to the restoration of the peace. I can talk a lot more about this, but obviously, I'm happy to sort of answer any other questions that they may have. But I just wanted to conclude also that Ukraine came to this situation, to this war with being more sort of prepared, but from the point of view that there is a whole sense of community organization and there is a large civil society sort of network organizations. I think the resources are being utilized, including women's organizations. A lot of women's organizations that are being providing humanitarian support, psychosocial support, mental health in some way. But also, like there were some examples like grandmothers, who moved. I have an example of someone who moved from Kyiv to Western Ukraine, and she was 82 years old, and then she started some kind of kitchen, and she started to produce food for territorial defense, for the military. They started to make this camouflage nets. So they try to get involved in some sort of production of meaningful support to the local resources and army, again, with the sense of being responsive citizen and hopefully that, that will restore soon. I just read before the call, I read something that it was a survey, nationwide survey that was made in at the end of April. The last, that's one of the 10th nationwide survey about Ukrainians that are being associated with the Ukraine as the Ukrainian citizens. So 92% of Ukrainians responded as they are Ukrainian citizens. And this is actually, the number is growing comparing to the one that was done in 2014, which was about 82%.
Right.
So there's a whole sense of unity and citizenship and camaraderie, that among the Ukrainians, and believe that they will win. And I do too.
I'd love just to ask you a question. There's been many analyses, and a recent one in the New York Times about the myths that are being spread or encouraged in Russia about how the invasion is being covered in Russia, and the debate about do most Russians really understand what's going on, or is the propaganda machine, or is what they're being now, how much is being absorbed and believed, etc. And just from a Ukrainian and someone who's worked in Moscow for 17 years, I mean, it's sort of, I'd be interested in your perspective on how much do you think that Russians know about what's going on, and how much information, unfiltered information, is available to them? Because what we hear is not very much.
Right. Well, a lot of my friends and colleagues, from Russia actually left the country, when they saw this coming, and they just simply decided not to be part of it. They just left the country went to Georgia, some went to other countries, including the United States, outside. They just don't want to be part of that regime. There are a lot of people, including part of my family, by the way, are in Russia. And the question is how much do they want to know, or how much they are being sort of washed brain by the propaganda. And I think the question is that it really depends of who wants to find that information. I think there's a lot of information that can be available. YouTube is still available. People can put the VPN connections, and it's not just about internet. There's a lot of propaganda pressure. There's a lot of, you can't imagine, how much of the pressure is coming from the national sort of channels. And I gave up actually even seeing this absurd. And there's a large portion of people who live in the other parts of Russia, over the Ural and Siberia. So that's kind of like a little too far for them to follow on that particular conflict. And they just live in a daily sort of environment and routines, on their own pressures. So I would say that people who want to know about this more and who want to be active, they can find this information. I'm sure they know about this. The question, how do they express themselves about this particular situation, being under the fear of being pressed, by the official government, that's another issue. So I think, strangely, actually, I've read that, no recruits, no army members from Moscow and St. Petersburg in Ukraine. They are not in there. They are from other parts of Russia, and from mainly from the behind Ural, parts of Russia. It's huge. So it's probably because of the disconnection. I don't want to speculate too much on this, but I think the question is that if people want to find information and want to know what is really happening, they can. There are a lot of channels on the YouTube people are watching, and I'm seeing that being signed up for that, that communicate this information. There's a large proportion of Russians who feel that there's a pride of Russia, and Ukrainians are pro-Nazis, which is very hard to believe, this pro-Nazi sort of notion, because they're bombing the eastern part of Ukraine, where the Russian-speaking sort of ethnic groups are, where Ukrainians live.
Right.
I just don't buy it.
Thank you, Victor. I think that was really important perspective. We'll open now. We'll start the questions because they have been coming in from people in the from participants who are listening. One question, Madeline, I know that you said that sometimes there's an overemphasis on the sexual violence as opposed to the full experience that women and others have in a crisis like this. But one of the participants, or a few of the participants, are asking questions about have we made any progress in holding perpetrators accountable for particularly crimes of sexual violence. I guess you could broaden that to crimes against, war crimes in general. But, have we made any progress, and is it particularly hard when the aggressor country is as powerful as the one we're dealing with now, and we have UN institutions which are completely dysfunctional once one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council is involved in a conflict? I mean, have you seen any moves forward on this?
Look, there's a lot of investigation ongoing. I mean, everything, the OSCE have done a report, there's a commission inquiry from the Human Rights Council, there's the ICC is engaging. So there's a lot of investigation going on, and there's, I think, probably better documentation in this conflict than probably from anywhere else, because it's so poignant and there's so many people there watching, and we know we do actually have mobile phones that can catch them on. In terms of the actual accountability, will there be justice? That's far more difficult because of the things you said, Kathleen, that look who is the overall architect of these war crimes and crimes against humanity. I think we have got to be forward-looking and know that justice will not be instantaneous, but still that should not deter us. The ICC is looking very much, and with Madre and others, into gender persecution as a really powerful tool to really get to who are the perpetrators. So everything from the individual soldiers right the way up to President Putin himself, who of course is the architect, as I said, of this. Will it happen? I don't know. It will happen. Whether it will actually reach its end goal. I do want to say something about the Security Council and how incredibly inept this has been from the very beginning. I mean, they should have gone in February to actually go on mission to Ukraine to assess the situation. They should have gone with the Russian Federation, say, if Russia, if you have got argumentation which actually documents your claims, let's see it, let's hear it. And instead, what you had was the invasion. You actually had then the ICJ ruling that Russia was committing an act of aggression and telling it to desist. No response there either. But they didn't go. They lost that opportunity. We are now saying they should go now. Again, with the Russian Federation, not as defending Russia's interests, but actually as part of Security Council responsibilities under the Charter. And then we could perhaps start seeing a move towards an accountability. I don't think Russia is going to accede to that, but we don't need a resolution for them to go. And we certainly need the Secretary General to be way more active than he has been. I mean, he did go after the letter was written, I think, by the ex-employees of the UN. I think that pushed him a little bit to make his trip to Moscow and to Kyiv after. But he needs to start thinking who else needs to be brought in. Who are the member states in the UN who are not saying that Russia is an aggressor in this and using their votes in the General Assembly and elsewhere, using their leverage? Because again, there is a charter for a reason. And I think the failure to uphold that means that they are complicit. So I think we're really going to look to law as a way of actually getting to some form of justice and accountability. And we've got to use that because military force will not do it. It will not do it. So it will take a long time. But I think we do now have the tools if we apply them effectively and coherently amongst the states and others and the other institutions who are tasked with actually making that happen.
Great, thanks. You know, a related question for you, Paul, because of your long humanitarian experience. What do you think is international humanitarian law taking another hit in this? I mean, is it playing any role at all, or is it just completely ignored in this? You know, we've seen the more powerful the aggressors, the more international humanitarian law becomes irrelevant. I mean, it just, you know, the bombing of maternity hospitals and all that happening. I mean, where are we with, where will we be with international humanitarian law as a result of this conflict?
Not in a good place. I mean, it's already I think the number, at least 3 days ago, was over 164 health attacks against healthcare workers. And that's one component. If you look at, it started even before in terms of some of the migration and asylum abuses that are occurring in the UK, just what happened right now with Rwanda outsourcing all their asylum claims to Rwanda. So I think we've just consistently seen a degradation of international refugee law and international human rights and then basic humanitarian principles. So it's, yeah, I'm very sad. And this came up in obviously in Syria, in Iraq and Mosul, and what's happening in Ukraine is another example. And this, as Madeleine was saying, this lack of holding people accountable and the impunity just makes these both the laws, but then the UN Security Council and the UN seem quite impotent.
Yes. Another question from participants let's maybe, Jasmine, we could start with you, maybe others want to add, is what should we be thinking, or what's the lesson behind the difference in the way that Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed in Europe, as opposed to the way other refugees have been treated when they get to Europe? You know, I think there's probably not a lot talked about this right now because we're right in the middle of trying to support Ukrainian refugees, and nobody's suggesting that there should be any less support. But one of our participants is just wondering, is there any reflection already about why these differences, and if we should be learning anything from this?
Absolutely. And I think this is a wonderful question. I think also when a situation is unfolding, it's important to already start thinking about what can we learn from this long term and reflect on the differences with earlier situations. I think there are many lessons to learn. The question is, how likely is it that they will be implemented or applicable in the future? I think the current situation, I do not expect, for example, the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive in Europe. It was not activated when refugees from Syria came in, and I do not expect that to be activated for other emergencies happening elsewhere. So that is one question, but maybe another lesson relating to that is unity, like how European unity and a coherent response plays an important role. Also how a quick response helps streamline the reception of refugees. So instead of having people wait in limbo, stay in refugee centers, there are other methods and mechanisms with more a temporary status that could provide quick access to the labor market, to a country, to safety. I think there's a lot of lessons to learn there. I think also, and I think Paul was already mentioning this, but I think all of the speakers, the enormous outpouring of support from civil society and volunteers we have seen that as well from during the 2015 crisis or in other refugee situations, yet it's really outstanding this time, and also increased collaboration and formalization of collaboration across civil society organizations, governments, and volunteers. And I think there's a lot to learn from this and to build on this, and also to formalize these systems. So whether that would be through community sponsorship or private sponsorship to facilitate already through funding what is already happening in some countries in Europe, facilitating funding to volunteers who have people in their homes, but also making sure that people that take people into their home, that they are checked for safety. So people are not ending up in a situation of risk. And there's already measures at the EU level that are being created to help with, to streamline all these processes. So I think there's a lot to learn. Yet I think there's also been a lot of discussion and reflection on the very different response. And that is in a way very, I hear stories sometimes relating to more racism or xenophobia or with religious arguments. But I think another part is, I mean, they may play a part. I think there should be more research into what really happened here, but some parts are also just the official policy lines and policies of different countries. For example, Rus crisis very recently, and there was a very different response from Poland at that time, and that was just this winter. And it's very dramatic to see this massive change, but at the same time, there is an official policy to welcome people from neighboring countries, have reception in the neighborhood. And in that way, it fits with existing, it's just a consistent application of previous policies. However, the ethical and moral component of it is a different story, in my opinion. And I think there should be more reflection on that. And potentially, hopefully, the very welcoming response, maybe this could help people reflect more on and I think thinking of the many Polish people that have refugees in their home right now, to have this very personal eye-level experience with this is what it means to be a refugee. This is what it means when you fear for your country, when you're not safe. Maybe you have loved ones saying people don't want to leave their country. And maybe this could create more understanding also towards other groups. But that's speculation at this stage.
Right.
But I have high hopes.
Thanks, Jasmine. Paul, there's a question specifically for you. People wondering, it's related to this, people wondering whether you saw sort of ongoing segregation or different treatment when you were in the neighboring countries. I think because there was a lot of coverage about, even during this crisis, people who were not Ukrainian, but who were living in Ukraine, who were trying to get into the same places Ukrainians were trying to get in, and weren't having the same level of welcome, should we say. Did you see vestiges of that?
I did not, but I certainly spoke with the International Organization of Migration, and that the acronym is TCNs, the third country nationals, and I think we all read about both the African students, the Indian students that were treated very differently when they were crossing the border. I didn't see that firsthand. But even within, and this is, and again, every country you've seen, whether it's a religious or an ethnic minority, I'm not sure if we've spoken yet about the Roma and the implications there, but I did see, while it may not have been overt differences in support, it was very clear in the reception centers. In the reception centers, Roma were amongst the Roma compared to non-Roma. And this is only anecdotal because the systems weren't yet in place, but it was taking them longer to leave the reception centers and go to various places than it was the non-Roma. And then getting back to, I mean, I guess all related is it's interesting from both a personal and then a professional point of view. I just come back 2 months before this. I was in Afghanistan for WHO just as the Taliban took over, and the situation there is extraordinarily difficult. And when you see this pivot of the global community towards Ukraine, by no means begrudging how everyone is treating the Ukrainians and the welcoming, it's fantastic. That should be the model. Of course it should be, but it generally isn't and likely will not be. And if we look at the politics in some of the countries in Europe and Poland and Hungary, it is quite extraordinary to see the differences in how they were treating the migrants and refugees with fences and other areas, and now opening up. And looking at the politics, let's see, there was a very interesting election both in France but in Slovenia, where another government that was more welcoming was voted in. I think a lot of the populism that's occurring there will have a big effect on how migrants and refugees will be treated in the near future.
Madeline, did you want to add something to this?
Well, no, it was on the previous one I wanted to comment really,
Yeah,
which is on
please.
the death of IHL, which I think, Paul, I agree with you. I'm also going to say that I think that it's about time we rethought IHL in any case, because basically it's legitimizing war. It just says what you can smash and who you can kill, not that you shouldn't smash and you shouldn't kill. I really think that we need to, when we go codifying towards, more towards the ICC model, it's those international crimes we want done, rather than saying there are particular laws which apply during armed conflict, because they should apply. And that must mean ending, preventing conflict and having accountability mechanisms in advance. And just one more thing as well, I think when we're talking about accountability, I do feel we should be looking beyond just the Russian accountability, but to the enablers. And those, if you look where the sanctions are coming from, or where they're targeting, it's the banks, it's the corporates, it's the political parties, it's those who were enabling a regime like that to enable oligarchs to take advantage of the Russian people. And essentially, they're the robber barons, And so there needs to be an accountability mechanism, so we don't just immediately go back to doing exactly the same thing on a global scale, which facilitates the creation of a militarization process to keep in place those people who are taking advantage of their populations, because that makes us absolutely complicit. So we really need a fundamental change in the way that we actually do our business. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Victor, there's a question for you about the large number of displaced people that appear to have gone to Russia, many against their will. And do we have any objective information, or are you aware of objective information on this, on how they've been received and treated, and whether they're able to move on to other places once they're have left places like Mariupol, for instance?
I know there's a large number. I'm not sure about a huge number. There's a large number of Ukrainians that have been taken to Russia. Some of them I know being placed in more central parts of Russia. How they've been treated, I just don't have that updated information. But this is happening, and they call sometimes the filtration set of camps. Initially, they put them in and they take them over to the sort of the parts of Russia that are more behind the sort of the Ural sort of area, and sort of Western Ural, Siberia, that part of Russia. I have to look more. I don't really have that information in terms of what are the intentions and what is the longer term set of plan for that.
Right. I don't know if any of the other panelists have anything to add on that. I don't think there probably is a whole lot of information on that at this point.
Maybe just to add Kathleen, it came up numerous times in terms of the UN is, well, what about the Ukrainians in Belarus or in Russia? Because we were responsible for the surrounding countries. And that was also something that we were not involved in. We had, I think it would be very difficult for the UN right now to have access to and get involved in those areas, which again shows some of the limitations.
Right. Thank you, Paul. Madeline, a question about at one point in your when you were speaking, you talked about the feminist reaction to the fact that women in Ukraine, or maybe that women in Ukraine are disappointed that their role as fighters maybe is not being sufficiently appreciated or raised, which one can understand. And at the same time, to an organization like the Women's League for International Peace and Freedom, that may not be exactly where you want to put the emphasis on women's role. I mean, how are you trying to deal with that contradiction in this setting?
What a question, Kathleen. I was supposed to answer that one. It's incredibly difficult because, I think all of us can completely understand why it is that people would seek to defend themselves. I mean, just but completely understand. And sort of, in a way, we're being asked a question that, what would we do, when we're saying we should never have to ask that question because we should have done all the work before. And if you'd been listening to what we've been saying all the time, there wouldn't be that question. And I think that the problem we've got is we've now got into this situation. And so what do we say? And we're saying that the only way is to find a peace process. Whilst there can be incredible amounts of admiration for what people are prepared to do to defend themselves and their families and their loved ones and whatever, the idea that violence is the answer is not one that certainly the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom could endorse, even though individually, I think there's not one of us that doesn't understand the incredibly difficult choices that are having to be made. But nobody wins a war. Nobody wins a war.
Mm-hmm.
Even if technically you do, no, you don't. You can't just count up who's killed the most people, damaged the most, and then say, well, we won. That's just not, it's ridiculous, actually. I mean, it is actually ridiculous when you think of it. In this day and age, that's how we decide we won a war. Mm-hmm. So you don't. But it's a very, very difficult question to answer. And I do think there's a beginning of a change. I'm beginning to sense a beginning of a change. And that because before, more women were wanting to go and fight than there are now. And now they've switched to wanting to do more humanitarian stuff. That seems to be the beginnings of a change. But I don't know that for sure. I don't know that. And the other thing is, we don't talk about the men who don't want to fight. Basically, what about all the guys who are conscripted and have to go, whether they want to or not? And I think that's particularly true of the Russians. When you said, Victor, that they're coming from the rural areas, so that basically you keep the families of the intelligentsia out of the front line, if you like, the ones who are most likely to complain. That's what you do. You just put them in as cannon fodder, and it's absolutely tragic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think one last question before we close. There are some participants wanting to know a bit more about what the international community is doing or can do for something Victor raised in his remarks, which is all the support that's being offered to internally displaced people within Ukraine. Is the UN there? I know, Paul, you were in the neighboring countries, but is the UN there, or international agencies are there? And if they are, is that more of a traditional operation going on within Ukraine? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Are you asking me, Kathleen?
Yeah, if we just start,
Yeah.
if you have any thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, no, although I was not there, I was speaking to my colleagues all the time, because we were also working a whole other issue. WHO was working on the emergency referrals from within Ukraine to the other EU countries, which is very important, and issues one may not think of immediately, such as what do you deal with patients who are hospitalized for mental health issues, for example, orphans and other orphanages, and how do you try to evacuate those people? So yes, the issue is, number one, which is positive, the Ukraine government is still in control and is trying to, and is leading the situation, but it's a bit more of a typical UN situation in terms of they're trying to support the governments in any way they can. They're quite operational, but the big issue remains, not unsurprisingly, security and the ability to move and to not move. And UNDSS, the Department of Security there, is also working to allow the UN to be able to move, and the INGOs have freer movement, as they often do. And the organizations like ICRC, MSF are doing, from a health point of view, a lot of work in those countries and are able to work there.
Right. And any comment, Madeline, or you mentioned it before, so maybe there's nothing to add, but not only international agencies, but the women's groups, particularly that have been in Ukraine for decades, they're still there. I mean, they're still in full operation in places where they can. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say full operation, but they're doing what they can. I mean, the Ukrainian Women's Fund has been incredibly active in distributing, again, more in terms of distribution of resources for humanitarian support and aid. But just something I did hear from some of the women who are still working there, who are working on the evacuations. And they're saying with the humanitarian corridors, that is what must be a priority for some of these besieged cities. And why aren't they talking to the women who are there as to how and in what way those humanitarian corridors could be set up? They did exactly the same thing in Syria, didn't consult, because they say there are ways in which this could be done. So I think, there's often a way of within the international community of conducting affairs which looks only to those who are wearing uniforms and carrying guns as to holding the information and being able to actually ascertain where and what is safe. Whereas proper and effective participation can make a huge difference. So I think the creation of humanitarian corridors, both for people to leave, but also to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid, is really, really necessary. And one more thing as well, I think there are real concerns by some who were part of the peacemakers. There's actually a website that was put up identifying peacemakers as now not being, or being basically insinuating they were traitors. And their names and addresses were put out, and now they have real fears, especially the men, that if they go through a checkpoint, they're going to be picked up. And I really want the international community to be paying attention to things like that, because just because you were a peacemaker does not make you a traitor now, not at all. It never did. But I think these are the sorts of things that will slip through under the radar screen if we are not paying attention, because this will cause the fragmentation of Ukrainian sense of community going forward, which really would be a tragedy after what Victor said and how well people have been pulling together to try and get through this in terms of their own resilience.
Great, thank you, Madeline. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists, we'll start with you, Jasmine, just to give a 1-minute takeaway as we close today, because we've covered a lot of issues from, the strain on the health systems, the role of local organizations, the various roles women are playing, international humanitarian law. But what's your takeaway for participants today?
Maybe a general one, because we have focused specifically on certain health needs and access to healthcare, but maybe to zoom out a little bit and think about the importance of health as it is when not promoting health right now and access to healthcare, it may have long-term effects, and it can prevent access to the labor market. It can prevent integration. It can create all these long-term issues. So I think there's long-term reasons why to invest in health right now. And even though Paul was mentioning all the great initiatives that are happening on the ground, I do see, especially thinking of the Temporary Protection Directive, that there was a lost opportunity to require European countries, EU countries, to set a higher bar. Now countries themselves have to fill in the gaps, and emergency healthcare is not enough. So that would be my takeaway.
Okay, thanks, Jasmine. Madeline.
I think the biggest one, and this is going to sound quite odd given the horror of the conflict, is this common humanity which has surfaced. there's this outpouring of support and care. And it's not about we hate Russians. It's not about violence. It's about we've got to help people. We've got to stand together. We've got to make sure that people can get through this, and how best can we help in whatever way we can. And I think if we could bottle that and keep it safe, so that when people are demanding that everybody runs off and joins NATO now or increases their defense budget by several billions, we need to be thinking, what is it that would really represent that care? And that would be investment in exactly the sort of healthcare programs that we need, exactly the sort of education systems we need. So we divert the resources away from the pretended security of militarized security, build on this common humanity, and actually move towards a system of care, because that's obviously what we want in the end. And that might actually do something towards saving the planet as well, really, which would be quite nice, wouldn't it?
Right, absolutely. Paul.
It's hard to beat saving the planet, but I would say yes. Of course, there's so much more that we and particularly the countries surrounding Ukraine could do, but it's been an extraordinary response thus far, both the people and by the government and municipalities, which I don't think we've talked enough about, or at least I haven't spoken enough about. What's been happening in municipalities has been quite extraordinary and quite organic. But I'm actually quite concerned over the next 6 months that the situation for the refugees is going to change for the worst. And I'm not sure yet if we've talked about it, but with the governments, but I don't know if the governments have really thought through what's going to happen with all of these people, and where are we going to put them in terms of shelter, and then what will the issues be, and the potential fraying of unity amongst the EU, of which we've already seen a little bit. And finally, just say we're concentrating a lot on the surrounding countries. But if you look, my understanding, looking at some Facebook data and other data, is that the #1 country where people are residing right now is Poland, then Germany, and then the Czech Republic. Those are the top 3. And we're not discussing that even as much because it's affecting countries far beyond just the 5 surrounding countries.
Absolutely. Victor.
Yeah, it's very hard to tell. Following on Paul's comment about what's going to happen in the 6 months, hopefully, things will get to more peaceful set of solutions. I really, really, really hope so, because we cannot, even this upcoming May 9th, the Victory Day, whatever they will declare, we will have to see. But obviously what I'm seeing, and again, I'm going back to the internally displaced people, because it's a large proportion of these people who are residing in Ukraine with all the limitations they have. I think that clearly shows that the resilience starts at the local level. I think that's where the local governments, those hromadas, they call them hromada in Ukraine, the community. It's a small local government led by the community members and leadership, working together with any civil society groups there, whether they're national or local, but also with the self-organization of those families that are there. They just really have the sense of support, mutual support. I think that's where the trust starts, which the accountability starts. I think that's where self-support starts. I think that's very important. In addition to any outside, any international groups that are providing humanitarian support, which is extremely helpful. It's not only helpful, it's essential. But I think that's where this collaboration is very important to make this robust local system that could respond to pressure. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. So I think we have the importance of health and access to health care, the bottling of a common humanity, thinking about the next 6 months and the pressures that will bring, and really the understanding and supporting of local resilience. I really want to thank all the panelists and turn it back over to Jim. You're on mute, Jim.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks to the panelists. I think this conversation could and should keep going on. I just had a little point that struck me, and both the absurdity of it, but the inevitability that this is going to continuing to be a pattern. The great optimism when UNHCR was established initially with a 5-year mandate, and the assumption that, you know, after the atrocities that gave its origin, that the world couldn't be so crazy to keep this up, you know, that we would get these things done. You know, but we're now a century past the conclusion of the war to end all wars, and it seems to keep on going. So I have a question for you, not for answer now, but to ponder as you go, because for those of you, and you know, who are one foot in the academy and the other foot in the practice of this, you must feel some great degree of frustration. You know, the humanitarian voyeurism as one goes from episode to episode, and we're still, as a world, very attentive to you for a few moments, and then we drift off into those other things. And as each emergency comes, so many of the things that we've learned in the past haven't been acted on. And there are so many things that, of course, we haven't learned yet. So much of the audience here is academic. And this is, of course, what Kathleen has been leading us on here in terms of our thinking. But so I would hope that, you know, you would think about, while you have this moment, at least, not this particular one, but this extended moment, that what is it that the academic community could and should be doing, you know, both in the moment, but also in the intervals. What is the learning? What's the durable learning that we need to help with? You know, accepting the fact that despite our cognitive dissidence, this is going to happen again, and probably again after that someplace. And perhaps each time, a part of our learning is in each of these times, how do we learn more about the absurdity? And I think perhaps we're doing that more in this particular case than we've done in some previous ones. And maybe there's some good to come out of that as well. But I don't think we can be blinded entirely by our optimism here. We have to recognize that it may be a part, you know, a residual part of our human condition, that your important work is going to need to continue for many years to come. So anything that the Academy, and certainly a lot of our students who are watching today, as they're shaping their careers, and you know, please give us your feedback, and we'll be very grateful to happen. Again, my colleague Kathleen, thank you so much for bringing your colleagues to the conversation and to this opportunity for all of us to learn, and good on you all for what you're doing, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.